land that was taken by force, that has never been ceded. And on your behalf, I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal leaders, past, present and to come. I'd also like to acknowledge the elders and the activists of the women's liberation movement upon whose shoulders we proudly stand. And I'd like to acknowledge, with her permission, which I have, the presence of Ros McLennan today, who is the General Secretary of the Queensland Council of Unions. Ros is here in her personal capacity, in her own time, and does not represent the QCU. Welcome, sister, and your daughter, Frankie. I have the joyful task of doing the thank yous. So I'd like to thank all of you, supporter participants who've come today. I'd like to acknowledge Sue, who hand-sewed all of the sashes, and there were a lot of them, and they've all sold out, so well done, Sue. I'd like to thank our t-shirt designer, Camilla, and our other designers, Steph and Tani. I'd like to thank the supporters of our Facebook page, the people who've stuck with us and who've continued to click like on our posts. And I'd like to acknowledge that in this political climate, that's actually an act of bravery. I'd like to thank our donors. We put out several calls for donations to make sure we could do today, and we collected so much money we were able to purchase a megaphone as well as cover all of our costs, and we have money left over for next year, so we'll be back next year. I'd like to acknowledge our official photographer Tony, who was also our photographer last year. I'd like to thank Hope and Jess, who formatted our flyers for us. I'd like to acknowledge Lead Marshal Maureen and her band of 4 marshals who will keep us in order on the march. I'd like to acknowledge the people looking after the IWD stall, Patricia and Hannah, thank you. I'd like to thank the 3 women who made up the panel to select the Eva Bacon Award winner, Patricia, Adela, Liz, and more of that later. I'd like to thank Nagas, who put together the mini videos that were on our face page. Thanks, Nagas. I'd like to thank the Red Rose Foundation, who had a breakfast yesterday morning, and at a time when many women's groups are distancing themselves from the IWD committee, Red Rose invited us to the breakfast, invited us to have a stall, and promoted our rally. Thank you, Red Rose. What follows is a statement from the IWD committee. The number of groups and individuals who've allied themselves with us this year in support of women's liberation is fewer than last year. That was predictable. Under neoliberalism, we've seen a resurgence in the first world of the drive to privilege men over women, to tell women who refuse to abandon women's specific struggles that we're not real feminists. We've seen a drive to emphasise fun feminism, choice feminism, over rights-based struggle for concrete gains, and to insist that feminism must mean all things to all people. Well, it doesn't. The hint is in the name. Feminism is about redressing wrongs and discriminations against females. Females are women and girls. It's about building women's liberation. Yet we see political women's organisations, women's services, a women's peace group, trade unions and otherwise progressive organisations readily abandon the fight for specific women's interests. We see them comply with the expectations from big corporations, especially biomedical corporations and big pharma. We see them succumb to bullying and in turn bully and isolate women's liberationists, and we've certainly experienced that at the IWD committee. There's no such thing as being neutral on women's rights. Silence sides with the oppressor. We all know that. Soviet dissident Yevgeny Yevtushenko is attributed with this quote: "When the truth is replaced by silence, the silence is a lie." That quote applies nowhere more appropriately than to women's liberation issues today. Let's be very clear. The women's liberation movement has been the staunchest defender of any social or political movement of transgender rights, and we've done it for the longest time. People's rights to housing, to work, to dignity, to acceptance, respect, to not be discriminated against. What the women's liberation movement will not do is deny the rights of women to organise against our own oppression. We won't deny biology. We won't accept the gender straitjacket that acts as a tool of male supremacy. Gender isn't about lifestyle, and it isn't about replacing sex-based rights with something else. Gender is about a hierarchical system that privileges men and places women, especially those whose gendered oppression intersects with class and race, right at the bottom. Women are an oppressed and marginalised group in every country on the globe. Privileged neoliberal lefty men have never acknowledged this. They've always denied or diminished sex and gender as a base of oppression, as of those who maintain actively the institutions of patriarchal capitalism. Women's liberation will never step back from campaigning for safety and fairness for women. Is it fair that women and girls must now compete against male-bodied people in sports such as cycling, weightlifting and running because the male-bodied people identify as women? Is it safe for women in prison to be housed with male-bodied people, even those convicted of rape, because the male-bodied people identify as women? Is it safe or fair for women in domestic violence shelters to be housed with male-bodied people because the male-bodied people identify as women? Is it safe or fair for lesbians to be told they're transphobic because they love only women? No. Is it fair to try to close down rallies like this one because it's run by women's liberationists rather than by neoliberal feminists? IWD is about celebrating women's advances, and we celebrate today. It's also about committing to the feminist fight back against women's oppression across the globe. And in that fight back, no matter how many other women's and progressive groups are silenced into submission, women's liberationists will not be silenced, nor will we ever subscribe to lies. The women's liberation movement endures many defeats. We will never be defeated. This IWD rally is about advancing the rights and interests of women and girls and imagining a future that's free of all forms of violence against women. Thank you.